All right, let's do this. Let's jump into Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life.
Sounds good.
We've got excerpts straight from the book.
Mm.
And I'm really curious to get your take on some of his ideas. I mean, the guy tackles some massive philosophical questions, but it feels like, I don't know, like you're just chatting with a friend at dinner or something.
Oh, cool.
It's not your typical, like, stuffy academic stuff.
Right. And in one of the excerpts, he actually talks about that, like launching right into these super deep existential conversations right there at the dinner table. No small talk, just straight to the big stuff.
Wow, that's intense.
Right. It's definitely a different approach.
Yeah, it kind of makes you wonder, have we lost something by making these intellectual discussions so, like, formal?
Interesting point. I think that's part of what makes Peterson connect with so many people, though.
Yeah, he's able to bridge that gap, between academia and everyday life.
Totally. Take his idea of maps of meaning, for example.
Okay, maps of meaning.
Sounds complicated, right?
Yeah, a little.
But at the core, it's about this basic human need that we all have. This need to move from like chaos to order.
It's that thing we all feel,
Yeah,
trying to make sense of the world, figuring out where we fit in.
exactly. And Peterson suggests we're all on this hero's journey, right?
Yeah.
Trying to find our way through all the mess and find something solid, something to hold on to.
And those ancient stories, the myths and religious texts that have stuck around for centuries, he's saying those are like maps for that journey.
That's exactly it. They give us these frameworks for understanding the chaos and finding meaning.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, I struggled a bit with his take on moral relativism and ideological indoctrination,
Oh, yeah.
especially his critique of how those ideas impact millennials.
I see it.
It felt a little harsh. I don't know. But is there some truth to his concern?
Yeah.
About a generation being taught there's no right or wrong, just power dynamics?
Well, Peterson argues that these teachings basically come down to two main points.
Oh.
One, morality is relative, meaning there's no objective truth. And two, all value systems are just tools for the people in power to control everyone else. Can you imagine being told that constantly?
Kind of a bleak worldview, yeah.
Totally. And it's easy to see how that could lead to this sense of like nihilism, right? Like, what's the point of anything? Especially for young people who are trying to figure out their place in the world.
Right, it's like a recipe for apathy.
And Peterson has seen this firsthand in academia. He argues it leads to a lack of personal responsibility.
Right, if everything's relative and there's no truth, then why bother striving for anything?
Exactly. And this brings us to one of his most powerful and maybe controversial ideas. He says, meaning, not happiness, is the ultimate goal of life.
Meaning over happiness.
Okay.
Remember that story about the literary agent who emailed him after that radio show?
I think so.
The one called Just Say No to Happiness?
Oh, yeah. Peterson is saying chasing that fleeting happiness, it's a shallow pursuit, especially when you consider all the suffering in the world. He challenges us to ask, what are we willing to suffer for?
Because that reveals what we truly value.
Exactly. And he suggests that instead of chasing fleeting happiness, we should focus on building character and finding meaning.
So it's not about just, like, chasing butterflies.
No, it's about finding something more substantial, something that gives our lives purpose, even when things are hard.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. Then he goes on to talk about the importance of shared beliefs, even suggesting they're essential for society to function.
It's like a social contract almost, right?
Yeah, these unwritten rules that allow us to cooperate and build communities.
And what Peterson finds so interesting is that these shared beliefs, whether they're scientifically true or not, help us make sense of the world.
Okay, how so?
They give us this framework for how to interact with each other, how to navigate our experiences. Think about it. Your relationships, your community, your workplace shared values are at play everywhere.
They're like the glue that holds everything together.
Exactly.
Now, to illustrate this whole order versus chaos thing, Peterson tells this really vivid dream he had while writing Maps of Meaning.
Oh, yeah. What was it about?
He's clinging to this chandelier in a massive cathedral, feeling suspended between the known and the unknown. I'm getting vertigo just thinking about it.
That is a powerful image.
Right.
So that dream, it's a metaphor for our existence, right?
Yeah.
The cathedral represents the order we create, the known, the familiar.
Okay.
But hanging onto that chandelier, that's the feeling of facing the unknown, the chaos that's always lurking out there.
And we're constantly trying to balance those two forces, aren't we?
Exactly. Comfort of order versus the excitement and maybe terror of the unknown.
And he argues that too much order leads to stagnation, and too much chaos is just overwhelming,
Right. We need that sweet spot, that
where
balance.
we can explore and grow without completely losing ourselves.
Exactly.
And that leads us to, well, one of his most infamous analogies, I guess you could say.
Which one?
Lobsters.
Ugh. Yes, the lobsters.
He's about to compare human social hierarchies to lobsters.
I know, it sounds a little crazy.
Little.
But bear with him. He explains how lobsters have these complex social structures.
Okay.
And their behavior, even their brain chemistry, changes based on where they are in that hierarchy.
So it's not just about who's the biggest and strongest lobster. There's like a whole neurochemical thing going on.
Right. He highlights how lobsters who win fights get this surge of serotonin, the feel-good neurotransmitter,
Okay.
and the losers. Well, their serotonin drops, leading to less confidence and a tendency to submit.
So where are we going with this? Are we just fancy lobsters?
Well, that's the debate. Peterson's critics say this biological view doesn't take into account how much social factors influence human hierarchy. It raises the question, how much of our social order is hardwired and how much is learned?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's complicated.
It is.
And then for a little bit of humor, he brings in Price's law.
Price's law.
The idea that in any field, the square root of the people doing the work are producing half the output. It's like in every office, right? A few people doing most of the work.
Yeah. And he uses this to highlight that hierarchies are often based on competence and contribution.
Which makes sense. The people who rise to the top are often the most skilled and productive.
Exactly. But it's not about being cutthroat, right? Peterson's advocating for recognizing where we fit in those structures and striving to be competent and contribute.
So find your place and be good at it. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, then he talks about nature itself being both dynamic and conservative. And he uses the yin and yang symbol to illustrate this.
Oh, I like that.
Me too. It's a great visual, right?
It is. So nature is constantly changing and adapting, but there are these underlying principles, structures that remain constant. It's like the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Okay, yeah.
And this interplay between chaos and order, it applies to the natural world and our social systems too.
He even suggests that human societies are inherently conservative, like they resist big changes and try to hold on to the structures that have worked in the past.
Right, which makes you think about how we approach social change, doesn't it?
He does.
Peterson isn't against progress, but he's urging caution. There's wisdom and tradition in those structures that have stood the test of time.
So maybe it's not always about should we change things, but more like how can we change things thoughtfully?
Exactly, without causing unintended consequences.
Okay, things get a little heavier now.
How so?
He talks about positive feedback loops and how they play a role in mental illness. He compares it to that awful screeching sound when a microphone's too close to a speaker. A small problem amplifying into something unbearable.
Perfect analogy.
Right.
Peterson's explaining how those loops trap us in these negative cycles, like addiction, for example.
Oh, okay.
You have a few drinks to relieve stress. It works temporarily, but then you need more and more to get the same effect. That's the loop taking hold.
Gotcha. And he uses a similar example with agoraphobia.
The fear of open spaces.
Right. So like a panic attack in public leads to avoiding those situations.
But avoiding them just makes the fear stronger.
It's like those negative thoughts and behaviors that just keep feeding each other.
Exactly. And Peterson really wants us to examine ourselves here. Are we stuck in any similar loops?
Are we repeating negative thoughts or behaviors even if they're not helping us?
Right. That's where self-awareness comes in.
If we can spot those patterns, then we can start to break free.
Exactly.
So we've talked about addiction, about fear. Now he kind of flips the script, right?
That's so.
He encourages being assertive, standing up for yourself, even says it's a sign of psychological health.
It's about recognizing your own worth and value.
Right. And he contrasts that with a more passive attitude.
Which can lead to being bullied or taken advantage of.
Yeah. And he's not just saying stand up for yourself for your own sake.
No, he's saying that by asserting our boundaries, defending our values, we contribute to a fairer world.
It's like if we all stand up for what's right, it becomes harder for bullies to gain power.
Exactly. It's a collective responsibility.
I like that.
He shares this really moving story about a client who had PTSD from his time as a soldier. What traumatized him the most wasn't the violence he witnessed, but seeing his own capacity for cruelty and aggression.
Wow.
It forced him to confront the reality that we all have this shadow side.
That's a tough one to face.
It is, but Peterson argues that by acknowledging those darker impulses, by understanding them, we actually become more whole.
Okay. So it's not about denying those parts of ourselves, but integrating them into our understanding of who we are.
Exactly. And if we try to suppress them, they just fester in the shadows.
Makes sense. He then gets into another key rule. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie.
Classic. But such a good reminder.
Right. It's easy to say be truthful, but Peterson links it to something bigger, to the very fabric of society.
Right. He's fascinated by how even small lies erode trust and create confusion, eventually leading to chaos.
So it's not just about being a good person. It's about the impact our honesty or dishonesty has on everyone around us.
He uses that example of the paranoid client who was deeply offended by any perceived lie.
Yeah.
This guy had been hurt so badly that he built up all these walls to protect himself.
It's sad, but it highlights how essential honesty is for relationships, for society,
Totally.
and that commitment to honesty extends to how we raise our kids, which brings us to one of Peterson's most controversial topics, discipline and responsibility in parenting.
Oh boy, this one always gets people talking.
Right, I can already hear the debate starting.
So Peterson's views on child rearing have definitely generated a lot of discussion, especially his emphasis on discipline.
And even punishment.
He uses examples from his own experience with his son, who, let's just say, was a bit of a handful as a toddler.
Really?
He actually mentions this hilarious story about his son refusing to go to sleep,
Oh,
and Peterson having to resort to unconventional methods to get him to settle down. I kind of wish he'd shared the whole story.
me too. But his point is that kids need boundaries,
Yeah.
consequences for their actions.
Exactly. And while he acknowledges physical punishment should be a last resort, he argues that sometimes, well, force is necessary.
To prevent a child from harming themselves or others,
Exactly. And that's where his critics come in.
accusing him of being authoritarian.
Right. But Peterson's careful to distinguish between appropriate discipline and harmful punishment. He's adamant that discipline should always be in the child's best interest.
Okay, so it's about teaching self-control, responsibility, respect.
Exactly. And he even connects this back to society as a whole.
Oh, how so?
He's saying that good parenting practices, they're the foundation for a well-functioning community.
It's an interesting perspective. I mean, if we raise kids who are self-controlled and responsible, it makes sense they'd be less likely to engage in destructive behavior.
Right.
He's saying good parenting isn't just about raising good kids, it's about building a better world.
Which is a pretty powerful idea, right?
Yeah.
It elevates parenting beyond just personal responsibility. It's contributing to something much larger.
It really makes you think about the long-term impact of our choices as parents.
Absolutely. It's a weighty responsibility. It takes courage, wisdom, and a willingness to face those tough moments head on. It's not about being your kid's friend. It's about equipping them to navigate the world successfully.
Brace yourself, we're going deep now,
Oh.
into the shadow side. Peterson doesn't shy away from exploring the darker aspects of human nature,
Yeah.
our potential for evil. And he brings in some heavy hitters, biblical stories like Cain and Abel, even fairy tales like Sleeping Beauty.
Wow, okay. I'm ready.
But he's not suggesting we embrace our dark side,
Yeah.
right? Or give in to negative impulses.
No.
It's about understanding them so we can manage them.
He uses that chilling phrase, shadow of the underworld, to represent those primal urges, the potential for cruelty. It's a sobering thought.
It is. So what's the Sleeping Beauty connection?
He uses it to illustrate the point that trying to shield ourselves or our kids from all negativity can backfire.
Like the king and queen trying to create a completely safe world for their daughter.
Exactly. But by doing so, they made her more vulnerable. By not facing any darkness, she couldn't develop the strength she needed for real life.
That's a really interesting take on that story.
It suggests that facing challenges is essential for growth, even if it means encountering darkness.
And that leads to his idea of sacrifice.
Yes. Facing our limitations, confronting our fears, taking on those tough challenges, those are all forms of sacrifice that lead to personal growth and meaning.
It's like choosing the harder path, knowing it'll ultimately make us stronger and more capable of living a fulfilling life.
And that leads us to one of Peterson's central themes, the value of sacrifice.
Sacrifice, okay.
He pulls in those biblical stories like the Garden of Eden and Cain and Abel to make his point.
And what's he saying about those stories?
Well, take Adam and Eve being kicked out of the garden. He suggests it represents humanity waking up to the reality of suffering and the need for work and sacrifice.
Paradise Lost.
Exactly. It's like before the fall, they lived in blissful ignorance, no work, no tough choices, no pain.
Ignorance is bliss, as they say.
Right. But once they ate from that tree of knowledge, they became aware of their limitations, their mortality, the complexities of the world.
And that awakening to suffering, that's what he sees as the beginning of true consciousness.
Exactly. It's the moment we realize we're not just passively receiving pleasure, we're active agents who have to make choices, often difficult ones, to create a meaningful life.
And that's where sacrifice comes in.
Exactly. Choosing to delay gratification, working hard, confronting our fears, those are all sacrifices that can lead to a better future.
It's about being willing to give up something today to build a better tomorrow, both for ourselves and for those we care about. It makes you ask yourself, what am I willing to sacrifice for a more meaningful life?
What are those things that are truly important to you, and are you willing to make the hard choices to achieve them?
Powerful stuff.
And Peterson takes this concept of sacrifice even further.
Oh.
He asks, what's the most significant, the most profound sacrifice imaginable?
Yeah.
And this is where he delves into religious mythology, specifically the story of Jesus Christ.
Right.
He views Christ's sacrifice on the cross as the ultimate example of giving yourself for the good of humanity.
Okay, that's a pretty heavy concept.
It is. And Peterson acknowledges that not everyone will accept the literal truth of the Christian narrative,
Right.
but he argues that the symbolism, the archetypes, hold deep psychological truths that can guide us towards a more meaningful life.
So it's not about specific religious beliefs. It's about those universal themes of sacrifice and selflessness.
Exactly. It's a message that transcends any one religion. It's about our shared humanity.
It's a reminder that we're not isolated individuals just pursuing our own desires. We're part of something bigger, and we have a responsibility to each other.
Yep.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Where does Peterson go from here?
Well, he then dives into this really powerful idea of meaning as the ultimate goal.
Meaning, okay.
He defines meaning as finding that balance between chaos and order,
That sweet spot, yeah.
living in accordance with truth, seeking what's truly meaningful, not just what's easy or convenient.
So it's not just about feeling good all the time. It's about aligning our lives with something bigger, something more substantial.
Exactly. He even asks this profound question: what's the most good I can do in the shortest amount of time? And then challenging yourself to live up to that answer.
Wow. That's a powerful call to action.
He emphasizes that meaning isn't something that just happens to us, right?
We have to create it.
Through our choices, our actions, our willingness to face challenges and contribute.
Okay, so we're not just along for the ride. We're actively shaping our own lives. And then he gets personal.
He does. He takes us on his own journey.
His struggles with doubt, his rejection of both shallow Christianity and ideological socialism.
And how he arrived at a deeper understanding of meaning and purpose.
It's a journey many can relate to, I think. Feeling lost and uncertain, searching for truth and meaning.
Absolutely. And ultimately what comes through is his message of hope. That by facing our limitations, by striving for good and pursuing what's meaningful, we can overcome that sense of nihilism and find a life worth living.
And that's a message worth holding on to.
It is. It really is. It really is. It's that spark of hope, that keeps us going. And Peterson doesn't just talk about finding meaning out there in the world.
Right.
He emphasizes this inner truth, this honesty with ourselves about our own flaws and areas where we can grow.
I like that. It's easy to point fingers outward,
Mm-hmm.
but real change has to start with looking inward.
Exactly. And he gives an example from his clinical practice.
Right.
He worked with this woman who was struggling after a sexual assault.
Oh, wow.
She was dealing with all this guilt and self-doubt, questioning if she was somehow to blame.
That's heartbreaking to think about the psychological impact of something like that.
And what Peterson observed was that she was bombarded with messages that put the responsibility on the victim.
It's like instead of support and validation, she was made to feel like it was her fault.
Exactly.
Which makes you think about the power of the stories we tell ourselves and that society tells us, right?
It's so powerful. Those narratives can either empower us or completely derail us.
Totally.
Peterson argues that victim blaming is incredibly damaging. It prevents healing and perpetuates a culture of silence.
Right.
And this dynamic, it's not limited to just sexual assault. It can happen anytime someone's been mistreated or taken advantage of.
It's a reminder to be mindful of those narratives we create. Are we constantly blaming ourselves or others?
Right.
Because if we are, we're going to have a pretty bleak view of the world.
It's about breaking free from that cycle of blame and focusing on solutions. And that takes us back to Peterson's emphasis on personal responsibility.
Right, that pull yourself up by your bootstraps message. It can be tough to hear, I get that. But I also think Peterson's not saying ignore systemic issues.
I agree.
He's focused on what we can control, our own choices and actions.
Exactly. He's challenging us to take ownership, to make the changes we need to make, to become the best versions of ourselves, even if it means having some tough conversations, like even reevaluating our friendships.
Wait, is he saying ditch your friends?
Not necessarily, but he does suggest we look at those relationships. Are they truly supportive? Are they beneficial?
Okay.
He even asks, would you recommend this friend to your sister, to your father? If the answer is no, well, maybe it's time to rethink that friendship.
That's a bold statement.
Mm.
But it does make you think about those friendships we hang on to out of obligation, even when they might be draining us.
He argues that it's not selfish to choose to be around people who inspire us, challenge us, support our growth. It's essential for our well-being.
It's about recognizing that our time and energy are precious.
And that leads to another key point, setting boundaries.
Boundaries, okay.
It's knowing what we'll tolerate, what we won't, and communicating that clearly to others. Peterson gives this example of a woman who was struggling to balance her career with expectations from family and friends.
It's that classic people-pleasing trap, right?
Exactly. She was overwhelmed and resentful because she felt guilty saying no.
You try to make everyone happy, but you end up miserable yourself.
And Peterson saw that her inability to set boundaries was actually hurting her relationships. She was spreading herself too thin.
It's a good reminder that saying no is okay. It's about prioritizing our own needs, setting limits.
Right.
It's an act of self-respect.
Exactly. And by setting those boundaries, we create healthier, more sustainable relationships.
That honesty piece keeps coming up. It seems to be at the core of so much of what Peterson talks about.
It really does. And it ties into his focus on understanding and accepting our own limitations.
Okay.
He brings up his daughter, Michaela, who had severe juvenile rheumatoid arthritis as a child.
Oh, wow. I can't imagine the pain and limitations she must have faced.
And Peterson is really open about his own struggles as a parent. You know, that frustration of feeling helpless and wanting to fix everything.
It's a good reminder that even the strongest among us are vulnerable to life's challenges.
Absolutely. And Michaela's story highlights that there are things we just can't change.
Right.
Sometimes the best we can do is accept those limitations and find ways to cope.
So it's about finding strength and acceptance, not denial.
Exactly. And this is where he brings in gratitude.
Gratitude, okay.
Even when things are tough, there's still so much to be grateful for.
It's about shifting our focus from what we lack to what we have.
Exactly. And this leads to another important concept, meaning making. We all have this fundamental need to make sense of our experiences, to find purpose, even in the face of adversity.
Okay.
And Peterson links this to the power of storytelling.
It's fascinating how we use stories to understand our own lives and connect with others.
By sharing those stories, we process our experiences, we help others make sense of theirs.
Right.
And he believes that the most powerful stories are the ones that grapple with the big questions, life and death, good and evil, meaning and purpose.
The stories that stay with us, that resonate long after we've finished reading them.
Exactly. They help us navigate the complexities of life.
And he's encouraging us to become active participants in our own stories.
Exactly. To make choices that align with our values, to strive to create a narrative that is both meaningful and fulfilling.
It's not letting life just happen to us. It's taking ownership.
Exactly. And this brings us to another key theme, confronting our own mortality.
Okay, mortality.
Peterson believes that by acknowledging the inevitability of death, we can actually live more fully, appreciate the preciousness of life.
That's an interesting perspective. I mean, you wouldn't think that focusing on death would make us appreciate life more.
He finds inspiration in the Stoic philosophers.
Okay.
They believed that meditating on death could help us overcome our fear of it and live more courageously.
So it's about accepting our limited time and making the most of it.
He encourages us to ask, what legacy do I want to leave behind? What impact do I want to make? What story do I want to tell with my life? It's about finding that purpose and living it.
That's a really powerful call to action. It shifts our thinking from what am I getting out of life to what am I contributing?
Exactly. And it brings us back to responsibility. Peterson is clear. We're not just passive recipients of fate. We have the power to choose our actions, shape our destiny.
We can create the life we want.
He doesn't have much patience for those who play the victim.
Right.
He challenges us to become the best versions of ourselves. He says true happiness comes from embracing responsibility, from striving to live a meaningful life.
It's a challenging message, but it's also incredibly empowering.
It is. It's about recognizing we have agency. We're not just pawns in some cosmic game.
You can make a difference.
And that leads to another theme that runs through his work, standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult.
Okay.
He uses the example of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian novelist,
Oh, all right.
who spent years in a Soviet gulag for speaking out against the regime.
His story is a testament to courage, standing up for truth and justice, even when facing overwhelming opposition.
Peterson argues we all have a responsibility to speak out against injustice, even when it's risky. He says silence in the face of evil is complicity.
So we have to use our voices to defend those who are vulnerable, to challenge those who abuse their power.
Exactly. It's about living with integrity, aligning our actions with our values, even when it comes at a cost.
That's a tough one, but so important. Okay, what about Peterson's views on gender roles? I know that's a topic that often sparks strong reactions.
It does. He's definitely stirred up some controversy in that area.
So what are some of his key points?
Well, Peterson acknowledges that culture shapes gender roles, of course.
Right.
But he argues that biology also plays a role.
So it's nature and nurture.
Exactly. And he's been very vocal about his opposition to the idea that gender is entirely a social construct.
Okay.
He sees that as more ideological than scientific.
So he's pushing back against that perspective.
He is. He points to research that shows differences between men and women in terms of brain structure, hormones, personality traits.
And what's he saying about those differences?
He's not saying men and women can't pursue any career or lifestyle they choose.
Okay.
But he thinks it's crucial to acknowledge these differences to understand them, rather than pretending they don't exist.
It's about appreciating the unique strength that both men and women bring to the table.
Exactly. He suggests that understanding those differences can help us create a more equitable society, one where everyone can thrive.
It's about recognizing the value of both perspectives, of both genders.
Now, Peterson is also known for his critiques of what he calls the excesses of the modern left.
He's not one to shy away from sharing his political views?
Not at all. And he does acknowledge the historical role of the left in fighting for social justice.
Right.
But he believes it's become increasingly ideological and intolerant.
Okay. So what are some of his specific criticisms?
He points to things like identity politics, the focus on political correctness, and this tendency to demonize anyone who disagrees with the prevailing narrative.
It sounds like he's concerned about a lack of open dialogue, that people aren't willing to listen to different viewpoints.
Exactly. He's especially worried about the suppression of free speech,
Okay.
both on college campuses and in society as a whole.
So he sees free speech as essential for a healthy society.
He does. He sees those attempts to silence dissent as ultimately harmful.
And this ties back to his emphasis on truth-seeking, right?
Totally. He believes that real truth emerges from open and honest debate.
So it's about having those tough conversations, being willing to challenge our own biases, and being open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
He advocates for considering all sides of an issue, acknowledging that complexity.
That humility piece is interesting. Recognizing the limits of our own understanding.
It's a key theme that runs through a lot of his work.
And it's not just about intellectual humility, right? He also talks about recognizing our limitations in other areas of life.
Exactly. And to illustrate the importance of honesty, he uses a really interesting story.
Which one?
Pinocchio.
Pinocchio.
Okay.
Okay, I'm curious. How does he tie Pinocchio into truth-telling?
Well, he points out that Pinocchio's nose grows every time he lies.
Right.
It's this physical manifestation of his dishonesty.
That he can't hide from.
Right. It's a playful metaphor, but it highlights the idea that lies have consequences.
For ourselves and others.
Exactly. And Peterson believes that to live a meaningful life, we need honesty.
Okay, so what about religion? Where does that fit into his worldview?
Well, his views on religion are pretty unconventional. He doesn't fit neatly into any box.
Right, he calls himself a religious pragmatist.
Exactly. He believes in the importance of religious traditions and beliefs, not necessarily because they're literally true,
Okay.
but because they provide a framework for making sense of the world.
So it's about the function of religion, not just the dogma.
He's drawn to the Judeo-Christian tradition, seeing it as a source of wisdom.
Interesting.
He recognizes that religion has been used to justify terrible things, but he thinks at its core, it's about seeking truth, goodness, and meaning.
So even if you're not religious, He's suggesting there's value in those traditions.
He thinks even atheists can benefit from studying those texts, to gain insights into the human condition.
It's about expanding our understanding of ourselves and the world.
Exactly. He's really advocating for intellectual exploration, for keeping an open mind.
That's a good thing. But he also seems to believe that we all need some kind of guiding principle.
He does. A set of values, a story that gives us a reason to get out of bed in the morning.
It doesn't have to be the same for everyone.
No, but we should be actively searching for something that resonates, that inspires us to be better.
Finding that spark, that passion that fuels us.
And once we find it, we have a responsibility to live it, to make choices that align with those values.
It's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. And Peterson also emphasizes the importance of facing our fears.
Okay.
He believes we grow by confronting what scares us, by stepping outside our comfort zones and taking risks.
I can see how that ties into his message of personal growth.
Right. We can't grow if we stay stuck. He tells this story about a client who was terrified of public speaking.
Oh, wow. I know that feeling.
Right. This guy avoided any situation involving groups, so Peterson encouraged him to gradually expose himself to what he feared.
So it's about facing those fears head on, not letting them control us.
Exactly. The message is that fear shouldn't dictate our lives. We need to challenge ourselves, embrace the unknown.
It's about expanding our horizons, realizing we're capable of more than we think.
And that leads to another key theme: developing competence.
Competence, okay.
Peterson believes we find meaning and satisfaction by becoming skilled at something we care about.
It's about mastering a craft, a skill. And not just for external success, but for that internal satisfaction.
Right. Exactly. It's about pushing ourselves, reaching our potential. He uses this example of a young man who is drifting aimlessly through life.
Lost and without direction.
Exactly. And Peterson encouraged him to find his passion, to dedicate himself to mastering it.
It's finding that thing that lights us up, that makes us feel alive.
Peterson believes that by developing that competence, we not only increase our chances of success, but we gain a sense of self-worth.
It's about feeling good about ourselves and what we can accomplish.
And he's a big advocate for self-improvement.
Always pushing us to be better.
Always. He thinks growth is a lifelong process. There's always room to improve. He suggests we honestly assess our shortcomings.
Take a good hard look in the mirror.
Exactly. Identify where we need to grow and actively work towards becoming better. And he's not afraid to give some tough love.
He's not one to sugarcoat things.
Nope. He says we should constantly be striving to improve our character,
Okay.
to cultivate virtues, to overcome vices. And he offers practical strategies for doing so.
Like what?
Drawing on psychology, philosophy, religious traditions, he encourages setting goals, tracking progress, and being accountable.
So it's not just about identifying our flaws, it's about taking action to address them.
Exactly. And celebrating the wins along the way. Now, I know some people criticize Peterson. They say he focuses too much on individual responsibility,
And not enough on systemic issues.
like poverty and inequality.
Right, and those are valid points. It's important to acknowledge those systems and structures that create barriers.
Peterson does acknowledge those issues exist,
Okay.
but he maintains that personal responsibility is still crucial.
So even when facing adversity, we still have a choice in how we respond.
Exactly. He uses Viktor Frankl as an example.
A Holocaust survivor.
Yes, Frankl's experience taught him that even in the most horrific circumstances, we still have freedom.
Freedom to do what?
Freedom to choose our attitude, find meaning in suffering.
To maintain our dignity as human beings.
Exactly. Peterson's saying we can't let our circumstances define us.
Powerful. So it's about finding that inner strength.
Exactly. And that connects to another theme in his work: finding order in chaos.
Okay, order in chaos.
The world is unpredictable, right?
Yeah,
But we can create stability in our lives
by doing what?
by establishing routines, setting goals, creating boundaries.
It's about creating a sense of control.
Exactly. And he links this to personal responsibility. We have a responsibility to ourselves, to others, to create order.
So, manage our time, fulfill our obligations.
He compares it to a ship navigating rough seas. The ship is constantly being tossed about.
But it can still reach its destination.
If the captain stays the course, if the crew works together.
So we can't control the storms, but we can control how we respond.
Exactly. We can choose to be tossed about or steer towards a meaningful destination.
Being proactive, not reactive.
He suggests developing a set of rules, a code of conduct. This creates order even when the world feels like it's falling apart.
It's like our own internal compass to navigate the chaos.
And this brings us back to understanding and accepting our limitations.
Okay.
He talks about his daughter Michaela again and her experience with arthritis.
Right?
It's a reminder that even in the face of incredible challenges, there's strength in acceptance.
We can't always fix things, but we can learn to live with them.
And Peterson shares his own struggle as a parent.
Wanting to alleviate her suffering, but realizing some things are out of his control.
It's a lesson in humility.
And that seems to be a key theme for him, right?
Yeah.
Accepting our own limitations, recognizing the complexity of the world.
Absolutely. He argues that we need to be humble, admit that we don't have all the answers, and be open to seeking help from others.
It's about recognizing that we don't have to go it alone.
And this leads to something that might seem surprising. Given his focus on order and discipline,
What's that?
Peterson emphasizes the importance of beauty.
Beauty. That's not what I was expecting.
Yeah.
How does he define beauty?
He argues that beauty's not superficial or frivolous.
Okay.
It's a fundamental part of the human experience. It connects us to something larger than ourselves. We find beauty in nature, art, music.
Even the human form.
Exactly. These experiences, they inspire us. They uplift us.
They give us a sense of awe.
Exactly. And he links this to meaning. Beauty is a sign of order, harmony, something greater than ourselves.
So by seeking out beauty, by appreciating it, we find meaning.
You think so?
It's about appreciating the good, the true, and the beautiful.
Peterson's work has generated a lot of debate, as you know.
He's a controversial figure.
He's definitely polarizing. But regardless of where you stand on his views, there's no denying his thought-provoking.
He challenges us to think deeply about life,
And that's why we're doing this deep dive.
to explore his ideas, engage in discussion, and see what insights we can take away.
Speaking of insights, Peterson talks a lot about paying attention,
Paying attention, okay?
about noticing the detail.
It's easy to get caught up in the busyness of life and miss those little things.
Exactly. He uses this analogy of a detective solving a crime. The detective has to pay attention to every detail, every clue, to figure out what happened.
It's about being present, being observant,
And Peterson argues we should approach our own lives with that same attentiveness.
noticing those subtle cues that might reveal a larger story,
Exactly. It's about being mindful.
being present in our everyday lives.
And he connects this to self-awareness. By paying attention to our own thoughts and feelings,
We can understand ourselves better.
and identify areas for growth.
So it's about being both inward and outward focused.
Exactly. And it's about being present in the moment. Peterson argues that we often spend too much time dwelling on the past, worrying about the future.
We miss out on the now,
And he suggests that by focusing on the present moment,
appreciating the simple things.
we can find a sense of peace.
That feeling of contentment that's so elusive.
And he ties this back to gratitude.
Okay, gratitude again.
By appreciating what we have, we shift our focus away from what we lack.
Recognizing the abundance in our lives.
Exactly. Now, Peterson is also a strong advocate for purpose.
Having a sense of purpose, okay.
He thinks it's essential for a fulfilling life. We need that direction.
Something that gets us out of bed in the morning.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be this grand, world-changing goal.
Right.
It can be something simple.
Raising a family, pursuing a passion.
It's about finding something that aligns with your values. And he connects this back to responsibility.
All right.
Once we find that purpose, we have a responsibility to live it.
To take action.
Exactly. And you could argue that Peterson's work is a response to what he sees as a crisis of meaning.
A crisis of meaning,
He thinks a lot of people feel lost, directionless.
which leads to anxiety, depression.
He suggests this is partly due to the decline of traditional sources of meaning.
Like what?
Religion, community, family. Those institutions have weakened, and people are searching for something to believe in.
Searching for meaning.
And his work seeks to provide a framework for finding it.
In a world that often feels meaningless.
Exactly. He encourages us to look inward, to develop our character, to embrace responsibility.
To find something to believe in.
It's a powerful message.
It is. It's about taking ownership of our lives and creating that meaning, both for ourselves and the world.
Peterson's work is definitely full of provocative ideas.
Challenging concepts.
It's not for everyone.
Right.
But whether you agree with him or not, he's a thought-provoking thinker. He forces us to grapple with the big questions.
He pushes us to think critically, to engage in a dialogue.
And that's what makes his work so valuable.
Agreed. It's not a set of dogmas.
No.
It's a framework for thinking, a toolbox.
Exactly. Speaking of complexity, Peterson has a lot to say about good and evil.
Good and evil, okay. Those are pretty fundamental concepts
He argues they're not just abstract ideas, they're fundamental realities.
that shape our world.
He uses myths, literature, to explore their complexities.
It's about going beyond those simple definitions.
He suggests that good and evil aren't opposites, but intertwined forces.
Existing within us and in the world?
Exactly. And he thinks understanding these forces is crucial for living a meaningful life.
So it's about acknowledging that duality in human nature, the capacity for both darkness and light.
And it comes back to personal responsibility.
Our choices have consequences.
We're not passive observers, we're active participants in this battle.
It's a sobering thought, but it's also empowering.
It means we have a choice. We can choose to act in ways that align with our values.
Okay, what about Peterson's view of truth?
His views on truth are also pretty controversial.
I can imagine.
He argues that truth isn't just subjective opinion.
It's not just what we want it to be.
It's an objective reality. It exists independently of our beliefs.
So there is such a thing as truth.
He believes there is, and pursuing it is essential for a healthy society.
Yeah, and for our own well-being.
He says it requires a willingness to challenge our biases, to acknowledge we might be wrong.
That humility again. Recognizing the limits of our own understanding.
And he links this to free speech.
The free exchange of ideas is crucial for the pursuit of truth.
He thinks so.
And silencing dissenting voices is harmful.
Exactly. It's about creating space for dialogue even when it's uncomfortable.
Okay, so he likes to use stories and metaphors, right? To illustrate his points.
He loves them.
They make his ideas so much more accessible.
One of his most famous analogies is the hero's journey.
Oh, the hero's journey.
To illustrate the challenges of personal growth.
Right, it's such a classic story structure.
He points out that the hero usually starts out in a state of comfort, right?
Right.
But then they're called to adventure. They face trials, they struggle, and they emerge transformed.
It's a journey we can all relate to in some way.
And Peterson argues that we can all embark on our own hero's journey.
By doing what?
By stepping outside our comfort zones, by confronting our fears, by striving to live meaningful lives.
Okay, it's like he's giving us this call to adventure.
Exactly.
To embrace the challenges of life. Now, he's also known for his views on order and structure.
He believes they're essential for well-being and success.
So creating order in our lives can reduce stress.
He thinks so. He argues that chaos is inherently stressful, and we can reduce that stress by establishing routines, setting goals, creating boundaries.
It's about bringing some stability to our lives.
And he links this back to personal responsibility. We have a responsibility to ourselves, to others, to create that order.
It's about being reliable, dependable.
Exactly. And Peterson's work is often seen as a response to what he sees as a crisis of masculinity.
Oh, a crisis of masculinity.
He argues that many young men today are struggling to find their place.
Okay, that's a tough topic.
Yeah.
What does he think is contributing to this?
He suggests it's partly due to the decline of traditional male roles.
Okay.
And the rise of feminism, which has obviously been a positive force for change.
But he's saying it's also led to some unintended consequences for men.
He thinks so. He says in the past, men derived their purpose from roles like provider and protector.
And those roles have shifted, become less defined.
So some men feel lost, unsure of their place.
It's like they've lost their compass.
And his work aims to give them a roadmap. He encourages them to embrace their masculinity, to develop their strength, to take responsibility.
To find their own unique path to fulfillment.
Exactly. He believes that by doing so, they can find happiness and contribute to a better world.
It's a message of empowerment and responsibility. And Peterson's work overall, it's full of thought-provoking ideas.
It really is.
Challenging us to think about ourselves and the world in new ways.
Whether you agree with him or not, there's no denying he's sparked important conversations.
He's asking us to think critically, to find our own truth.
And speaking of truth, he talks a lot about finding a balance between order and chaos.
Order and chaos, okay?
He argues that both are essential for a healthy life.
It's about finding that sweet spot, that dynamic tension.
Exactly. He uses the analogy of a garden.
The garden.
A garden needs both structure and wildness to thrive.
Too much structure, and it becomes too rigid. Too much wildness, and it's overgrown.
Exactly. Our lives are like gardens.
We need to nurture both order and chaos to find meaning.
And he connects this to personal growth. We grow by stepping outside our comfort zones.
Which involves chaos and uncertainty.
Right. But we also need a foundation of order in our lives.
Something to ground us.
Peterson is also known for his views on mythology and storytelling.
Oh yeah, the power of stories.
He argues that they're not just entertainment.
Right.
They're a fundamental way that we make sense of the world.
They connect us.
He suggests those great myths, they contain timeless truths.
And by studying them, we gain insights.
Exactly. It's like looking in a mirror. And then he ties this to the idea of meaning making.
Okay.
We create meaning by telling stories about ourselves, our experiences.
About shaping our own narratives.
Exactly. And the stories we tell ourselves, they shape how we see the world.
It can be empowering, but it can also be limiting.
Right.
Right.
Peterson's suggesting we become aware of those stories.
So we can have more control.
Exactly. He's a complex figure, wouldn't you say?
He is. And his work, it sparked both praise and criticism.
He's definitely polarizing. But regardless, he's a thinker who challenges us.
He pushes us to grapple with life's big questions.
And to strive to be better.
He's not giving us the easy answers. He's asking us to think for ourselves.
And that's what makes his work so valuable.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Jordan Peterson's world.
What do you think is the most important thing listeners should take away?
It's a good question. I think it's this. Meaning is not just handed to us.
We have to create it.
Through our choices, our actions, our commitment to living a life that's both fulfilling and responsible. It's about taking ownership.
And striving to make a positive impact.
That's a powerful message. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.
We hope you found it thought-provoking, maybe even a little challenging.
And remember, to borrow from Peterson himself, sort yourself out.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep striving to make the world a better place.
Until next time.